Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Transportation Equity, Rethinking Transportation Planning Engineering, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in partnership with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Jill Lemke and I serve as Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and as a member of the Smart Growth Network Steering Committee. John, it's not advancing.
That's because you're going to have to put your pointer inside the active PowerPoint screen and click.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. The Smart Growth Network is a national alliance of advocates, practitioners, policymakers, and local leaders, all working towards a shared vision for land use and infrastructure policies and actions that result in healthy, sustainable, equitable, and prosperous communities for all. In addition to hosting webinars, our website at smartgrowth.org provides information on effective planning, development, and preservation practices. The website is currently going through a transition, so stay tuned for updated Smart Growth content. This webinar is one of a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning related topics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with past webinars for viewing via the Maryland Department of Planning's YouTube channel. The Planning Department's website also provides valuable information on statewide planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities at planning.maryland.gov. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn more about our upcoming programs. It is important to note that the views expressed by the speakers are those of the speaker and not necessarily those of the Maryland Department of Planning, the state of Maryland, or the Smart Growth Network. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits and 1 Equity CM credit from the American Planning Association. To receive AICP credits, visit the APA's website, planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, Transportation Equity, Rethinking Transportation Planning and Engineering. You can also search for the event number 927-6662. Our speakers today are Veronica Davis and Lynn Peterson. Veronica Davis is the Director of Transportation and Drainage Operations for Houston, Texas. Veronica has nearly 20 years of experience in engineering and transportation planning. She is an entrepreneur, a civil engineer, and co-founder of Inspire Green LLC, where she, among other projects, led Vision Zero action plans for both Washington, D.C. and the city of Alexandria. She co-founded Black Women Bike, an organization and movement that builds community and interest in biking among Black women. Veronica was recognized as a champion of change by the White House in 2012. She earned a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Maryland, College Park, a Master's of Engineering, and a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from Cornell University. She completed graduate work towards a PhD in Civil Engineering from the University of Maryland at College Park. Veronica serves on committees for the Transportation Research Board, the Board for America Walks, as well as technical advisory boards at the University of Maryland and Cornell University. Veronica is the author of Inclusive Transportation, a Manifesto for Repairing Divided Community. Lynn Peterson is currently the Oregon Metro Council President, leading the nation's only elected regional government, overseeing regional services from affordable housing to trash and recycling, and of course, transportation and land use planning. Prior to her current role, Lynn was the first elected chair of the Clackamas County Commission and a member of the Lake Oswego City Council. She served as secretary of the Washington State Department of Transportation, overseeing mega projects, including the Route 520 floating bridge replacement and the 3rd largest ferry system in the world. She worked for Smart Growth America, training state DOTs in practical design, and served as Senior Transportation Policy Advisor to Oregon Governor John Kitzhaber. She served at TriMet, Portland's transit agency, 1,000 Friends of Oregon, and owns her own transportation consulting business. Lynn holds advanced degrees in civil and environmental engineering and urban and regional planning. Lynn is the author of Roadways for People, Rethinking Transportation Planning and Engineering. Following their presentations, our presenters will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question at any time by using the question tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. And with that, I'll turn it over to Veronica Davis. Welcome, Veronica, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, good afternoon. I am trying to. Do you all see my screen okay, Jill?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, great, thank you. So good afternoon. My name is Veronica Davis. I have my, I guess, formerly Twitter, x.com social media handle, and then my personal website, veronicao.com. As mentioned, I am the Director of Transportation for the City of Houston, but today I'm reflecting myself and my own views. Just to give a little bit of overview of, doesn't look like it advanced.
It did. I'm seeing table of contents.
Okay, great. So just to give an overview of the book, so the table of contents, it opens up by a foreword with Tamika Butler. For many of you in the industry may be very familiar with Tamika and her work. I consider her part of my Brain and Heart Trust. And so I'm really thankful for not only her taking the time to review the book, but also taking the time to set the tone for the overall book. I also talk about a preface. I actually started this journey in 2018. And over time, the world has changed. And so trying to, put in the preface and even having self-doubt as an author. In the introduction, I give a little bit of the state of the industry, including what has happened with COVID and everything and how that really changed our transportation industry in a way that we weren't anticipating, but also framing it in terms of equity and how with George Floyd and everything around that particular incident, how it did change the conversation around equity in some cases. And so that's the introduction. And then 6 main chapters. And so overall, I took on the format of trying to provide ideas, trying to provide case studies, but most importantly, giving you time to reflect, giving you time to think. I wanted this to be a book that you didn't just read and highlight and put it on the shelf, but it's that book that you carry with you into meetings. And so each chapter, there's opportunities for reflection. In some chapters, I actually give you an opportunity to reflect before you dig in. And so chapter 1 is transportation is personal. I share my transportation story. I invite all of you all to think about your transportation story. And it doesn't have to be anything traumatic. Mine just happens to have a little trauma involved, which I'll talk a little bit later in this presentation, but it doesn't have to be that. It's just getting you as a practitioner to understand, why do you make the decisions that you make? I think sometimes we can get so focused on the work that we forget to bring ourselves into it. In chapter 2, I talk about equity is more than a baseball graphic, and I'll talk just a little bit about that later on in this presentation. Chapter 3, should there be a war on cars? I do tackle that subject and the impact that cars have had on our environment, good and bad. I don't necessarily answer the question, should there be a war, but I do invite the reader to pontificate on just the impact of cars that they've had. In chapter 4, power, influence, and the complexity of people. That was actually one of my favorite chapters to write, and it was one of the second chapters that I wrote. And I really try to think about stakeholders based on my experiences, both as owning my own consulting firm and then also working in city government prior to this job. So really just thinking about the stakeholders, how to understand what they need, being okay with not being able to get to consensus. I think sometimes we feel like We have to walk away from every project feeling Pollyannish where we've gotten there, but sometimes it's okay not to have consensus. And 5, bringing it all together, where I walk through some of the challenges right now as an industry where we have really great engagement, we have really great transportation processes, but they don't always inform each other. And so really taking the time to give a framework where the transportation and the engagement can truly inform each other. And with that, it can look like different things. You may need to have some additional steps, but it's just a framework to think about and start from. And then lastly is the call to action. What do we need to do to change our industry, both small, I give you very small steps, and then also some larger steps to consider. So how we designed our systems? And I know the we is many of us, both as panelists and as you all listening. We weren't here when the system was designed, but we've inherited this system, and we attempt to work through all of that. So this is actually a quote. I had written a paper previously about the American dream. And one of the first kind of introductions of the American dream was this quote by James Truslow Adams in 1931. And he says, life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to their ability or achievement. The thing that's very significant, if you think about this time period, we're not that far removed from the Civil War. We're not that far removed from the Reconstruction period. We haven't quite yet got to the Civil Rights era, but we're definitely in the peak of, the Jim Crow era. And so in having this American dream, many people were left out. This is a screenshot from my computer, and I just did American Dream ads. This is not, I don't have the ability to be this graphic, but this is just a screenshot of American Dream ads. And one of the things that you'll notice, every ad, it's a family. It is a mom, a dad, a little boy, a little girl, maybe a pet. But that's really who the American Dream was built for. And I think that I don't go too deep into the history within my book, because I feel like there's a lot of documentation out there, but it would be remiss of me to not say that we did build our system based on a certain type of family. And I think that even now, as we think about what is considered a white American, it's also very clear to remember that this impacted Irish, Italian, and Jewish people. There are still today many communities where there are deed and covenant restrictions, and while they're not honored, but they still say, even just beyond Black people, that people who are of Irish, Jewish, or Italian descent are not to own this house. And I know there's a lot of work to remove that, but I just want to be very clear that this really was about what we used to call WAS, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And so that was considered who the American Dream was for. And even in this Google search, there is one ad that has people of color, and it's from 1937, and it's people of color waiting in the food line with this American Dream ad in the background. And so what happened is, as you have cars, it led to suburbanization. And so and I know we talk about, the highway system and all of that, but there had to be a plan. And so this is where I'm going to get personal, and I do share this in the book. What you see on the screen is a map of 1960. This is a parcel map showing the planned route of the I-10 expressway through East Baton Rouge in Louisiana. And that is where my family is from. And so what happened is, planners back in the day, they just looked to make the connection. They didn't think about the parcels per se. And largely this community was mostly Black and Italian. And this happened to be where my family lived. And so this is just a zoom in of that map, where I have arrows pointing to the north and then to the east to a parcel. On that parcel, on the front of the property, was my great-grandmother's house. And then on the back of the property was my grandparents' house. And that is where my mother grew up until she graduated high school. And so my family shared the parcel. And that is where you see this intention of building the highway through the neighborhood. This is a side-by-side, so 961 Myrtle Avenue, which no longer exists because there's no longer property there. On the left is a photo provided by my mom. It has my uncle standing in front of my great-grandmother's house. And then on the right is a photo that was taken in 2022 of that same parcel. So about where the tree is to the sidewalk, that was where my great-grandmother's house is. And the pillar towards the back, that is where my grandparents' house was. So they did lose their house in order to build the highway system. But what's really significant about this story, it's less about me, but more about my mother is very much in her right mind, and she was in high school when this happened. She was the last graduating class from her high school, which was demolished to build the high school, to build the interstate. And as we do our work in many of the communities around the nation, there are people today who remember when the highway was built. I think that sometimes, especially for my generation, and I'm a young Gen Xer, these things can feel so far removed. But my mother, for me, is my reminder that every time I go into a community, there are people today who are still clothed in their right mind, who are who experience this and who can remember and can articulate. And the result of all of this is, you know, we've built even wide roads, even beyond the highway system, we've built wide roads. And what we do know is, and this is dangerous by design, that who is constantly being hurt because of these. And you can show me a high injury network of any city, and I can probably tell you where the Black and brown and or low income people live. It is true across the nation. And so we've created a system where people are dying today, where we made decisions, where we typically have 6-8 lane roads, quote unquote, that go through a community and that are very hostile for people walking or biking or using transit. But where do we go from here? And this is where in my book, I attempted to have a little bit of hope. I am hopeful for the future, but I attempted to have a little bit of hope. In chapter 3, I talk about the equality versus equity. And some of us may have seen this graphic before. I think if you've been to any planning conference in the last probably decade, you've definitely seen this or some iteration of this. On the left is, you know, what is supposed to represent equality. Everyone gets the same. So each person attempting to watch the baseball game has a box that is of the same height. And so one person who can see, one has to stand on their toes, and the third person can't see at all. On the right is equity, and that is everyone giving what they need. And so therefore, everyone can see the game. But the challenge with that is the overall of giving everybody what they need. I know there's a lot of people that are viewing today that work in city government, working for NPOs, state governments. And what do we know is that we do not have the ability to give everybody what they need. We don't have the time. We don't have the people. I know right now the entire industry is struggling to get people. We do not have people. We do not have money. And so we have to make decisions. And that's where I share this graphic, and I'm going to go in a little bit more detail, but I share this framework. In working with Montgomery County, Maryland, on their Vision Zero equity plan, we did a lot of work with stakeholders. And instead of trying to have this everybody get what they need, really framing it more as an emergency room analogy. It's one of those where it really comes down to prioritization. When you go to an emergency room, you arrive as a patient, there's an intake process. Someone is trying to understand what is going on so they can understand the severity of your condition. Now, some people might be a hypochondriac and think they're dying, but they just have a little cold. And then someone may come in with trauma where they really need to be seen. But there's an intake process just to get an understanding of what is going on. And then within the emergency room, there's a decision framework for how they're going to see patients. Generally, they make, you know, as you come in, you're seen, but there is priority given to certain levels of people who are just at a different level of need. I remember when my daughter was an infant and she had an allergic reaction to egg. And even though we were the last people to walk into that children's emergency room, my daughter was the most critical, and everything stopped. Every doctor, every nurse moved away from their patient to get my child stable. And once she was stable, then they went to go work on their other patients. And so there is a process for in the order of priority. And so it is important, and it's hard. It is very hard. I'm not going to tell you that it's not, to have to tell some communities, not right now. I understand you have a safety issue, but right now we have our high injury network where people are dying consistently or they are being seriously injured. And we need to focus our resources in order to get those communities to a level of stability. And it's hard to hear. And I will say, I am very thankful for the bipartisan infrastructure law and the investment into areas of persistent poverty, which also tend to be high injury networks, and then even safety as a priority. It has given jurisdictions, cities, MPOs, states, funding that can just be shuttled into these communities that are constantly being harmed by traffic violence. And so our way forward, and this is where I get into the call to action. This is 355 in Montgomery County, Maryland. And not to pick on Montgomery County, I love Montgomery County, but this is indicative of roads that we see all across the nation. This one actually has a pretty impressive sidewalk. You see sometimes that don't have sidewalks at all, but you see this hostile environment, a pedestrian trying to get across, 4 lanes of traffic, almost 8 lanes at the intersection by the time you get all the way across. And so we can continue to move forward like that, or we can do something different. So one of the call to actions that I have in my book, and I'm going to end with just some pictures to hopefully give hope to all of us as we move forward in this work. But one of the things I say is, like, what if we just did things different? I know that the challenge of how we do transportation planning today is that we project from what's out there today, and we say, oh, there's going to be X number of more people, X number of more jobs, and this is how we need to do the transportation network. And what that has led to is we're building wider highways, we're building wider roads. And is that what we want to do? But what if, and I'm not suggesting we do it, but it's just a thought process. What if we just had a bold vision that said in the next 30, 40 years, we want to remove half the pavement within our area, our community? What does that begin to look like, and what does that open up? We want to remove every surface parking lot so that we can have more housing, more mixed-use development. And then it gives you, and I start the book, and then I'll end with some photos. I talk about, show me your transportation network, and I can show you what you value. And, we can have a future, and I love this from the Jetsons, because I was a child. We can have a future with all the technology in the world where we're still in traffic. And this is from the Jetsons, where he says, oh boy, this traffic jam is all I need. And we can continue forward with that type of future. Or we can look, and these are some photos that I took, that, what if you just don't need all of this pavement for cars? It opens up that you can have a really great, robust transit network that allows people to not have to have the expense of car ownership. This is also from Amsterdam, where there is car lanes, but the priority really is on people biking, people walking, and public transit. There are roads that are about this wide in the United States, and we have filled them up with motor vehicles. This is from Cali, Colombia, one of my favorite cities in Colombia, where they've taken roads and made them bus only, the entire road. And we pat ourselves on the back for our bus only lane. But what if we had roads that were just for buses, that allowed people the space and the freedom to move around? And then lastly, ending with Brussels, which is also one of my favorite cities. I have a lot of favorite cities, but ending with Brussels, where you have streets that are only for people walking. And look at the dynamics of this. People who are able to walk around, to truly window shop, without the stress of loud music, loud vehicles, and all of that. And that's a vision we can have if we want to be just a little bit bold to say that we want to do things differently. And so with that, I will end with my book information from Island Press, including the discount code that is exclusive to the listeners of this webinar to save 30%. And thank you so much. And with that, I will turn it over to Lynn.
Thank you, Veronica. That was great. I want to take off where you started and acknowledge the great vision that you've laid out there and the call to action in terms of how do we move forward. Roadways for People, Rethinking Transportation Planning and Engineering is specifically designed as a conversation starter for every organization and every advocate in order to rethink, that very boring process outline that we are all given, whether we are being asked to be part of a planning process or if we are setting one up. That map is what I want to talk about today and rethink what we're actually saying when we map out a planning process and who we are including and who we're not including. So next slide, please. So Roadways for People, want to go through just as Veronica did. There's a forward by Jeanette Sadikon, basically laying out. I'm hoping that this is something that people can marry up with NACTO when we go through the process for which we re-envision and get those big visions. How do you actually accomplish rethinking an existing roadway or any kind of transportation project that you're going to be looking at? We worked through why transportation planning and engineering need a paradigm shift. I think that Veronica's laid that out very well. The evolution of approaches to transportation engineering and planning. I think we need to get into engineer and planners' minds. And we'll talk a little bit about what I was taught and how I had to rethink that. Addressing the legacy of racist transportation and housing policy. We go into that in depth, but I'm not going to do too much of that. I'll skip over a bunch of that just because I think Veronica has laid out in her story really what we have seen across the nation and how that has impacted folks. How do we get out of our silos and start thinking from different perspectives? And then the community solutions-based approach, which I'll go into a little bit more based on this. And then how do we build communities of people streams? That's really what this is about. It is the fact that we in the past have used transportation as a way to build a project, but not as a way to build a community. And so that's most of what we need to shift in our thinking. Next slide, please. So here's little Lynn. I made that. I'm a sewer. I was in the traffic department at the Wisconsin DOT. I was preparing for a very long career in building roads, highways, and bridges. I had decided I wanted to do this at 12. And I ended up in construction at 19 with DOT. When I graduated, I was working full-time in the traffic engineering department and realized quite suddenly that my idealistic vision of my chosen profession wasn't as ideal as I had thought. It was one of my first projects that I realized that there were trade-offs that we were making on behalf of other people, entire communities, and it was causing real harm. And because it was Wisconsin, this first project was causing real harm to farmers and the environment. Next slide, please. So any of you from Wisconsin or from Illinois that have gone up to Wisconsin Dells to the north may know about Highway 12. It basically parallels I-90 going up north through Wisconsin, right past Madison. On the other side of Madison to the west is Middleton. And when I was a new traffic engineer, we got a new Secretary of Transportation who made a declaration on his first day that we were going to be taking this 2-lane rural highway and making it into a 4-lane divided highway based on a safety concern. I was in the traffic engineering department. I had never heard that this was a problem, but politically, suddenly it was a deal because he was a former business person from Wisconsin Dells. So I started to wonder how decisions were being made around me. And for 50 miles, every farmer in this corridor declared that DOT was the devil on handmade large plywood sheet signs that they put up and down the corridor. And I started questioning what I was doing in trying to make roadways faster, straighter, wider in the name of safety. But as we all know, it also increases access to farmland for developers with no plan to ensure farmland was not converted into sprawl. So I was asked to do the safety analysis and report after the project had been announced as a safety project by the newly announced transportation secretary. And what I found, and this will come as no surprise, is that the majority of fatalities was due to DUI. And it wasn't until later that I heard these words that kind of freed me, is that there is no way to engineer your way out of bad behavior. But that's not why we were actually doing this project. It was really about access to land and development. Next slide. Later, after I had left engineering to move to Portland, the local advocacy organizations in Wisconsin on the environmental side and the land use side, 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin, brought in Walter Kulash, a professional engineer formerly with Gladdings-Jackson. He offered another idea to not create sprawl and yet make safety improvements. So if you're going to take the problem statement up front that there is a problem, instead of doing the 4-lane divided that you see on the left of your screen, he proposed a 2-lane road that would be divided just a little bit and then have a gravel shoulder, and we'll come back to that, for the farm equipment. Just like the Amish are given in Amish country, where you have slow moving vehicles and you want to provide that safety. So he took the problem statement that was given to us by the secretary and took it as face value and said, but if you're actually trying to increase safety, you shouldn't be doing a 4-lane divided highway where you're increasing speed and you're increasing speed and you are actually not increasing safety. Why don't we actually work on what the problem is that people were trying to go around slow moving vehicles on a 2-lane rural highway. He also said something that blew my mind at Railvolution in 1998, I believe, and that was we could rethink the speed, the design speed. So why not design the speed of the road to be closer to the actual speed that you wanted people to be going that would be safe, and therefore your curvature would not have to take out historic barns that are part and parcel of that community's intergenerational wealth there. And so all of these things started to blow my mind back in the late 90s. But we still didn't have standards that would allow us to do these things, and we didn't have planning processes to include everybody in them. And so what got built was the design to the left. I refuse to go down that highway. Anyway, moving on. Next slide. So I've always believed that transportation could be a force for good. I still believe that, but we need to rethink how we do it. And most of the issues that society faces, transportation plays a supporting role. And we all know Secretary of Transportation Buttigieg's quote here, "At its best, transportation makes the American dream possible. Getting people and goods to where they need to be directly and indirectly creating good paying jobs. At its worst, misguided policies and missed opportunities can reinforce racial, economic, and environmental injustice, dividing or isolating neighborhoods, undermining government's basic role to empower everyone to thrive. Safe, affordable access is what transportation can provide or take away." So we need to think about how that applies to an inclusive process. Next slide. This is me in front of Bertha, the Seattle Tunnel Project, tunnel boring machine, as WashDOT secretary. But what I really want to talk about, because Bertha has successfully finished her project, and the waterfront in Seattle is a beautiful thing to behold if you haven't been there lately with the Alaska Way Viaduct coming down. We wouldn't have been able to do all of that project if we hadn't started thinking differently about how transportation can help. What I know as an engineer, having for Wisconsin DOT and then working through different parts of transportation, is I know how to design and build a dam. I know how to design and build a building. I know how to design a treatment plant, a sewage plant, and a landfill. Those basics are what I was taught in school of how to be able to determine when materials will fail. That's what I was taught in school. To be able to recognize when materials will fail. We do not want that. That leads to bad outcomes. But what I learned in engineering school as well is that I was going to be measured by these 4 standards as a transportation engineer. I needed to design a safe project for as many vehicles moving as fast as possible with an on-time project delivery and under budget. That was it. That was what success was measured by for my career in engineering. So I decided to earn that master's in urban and regional planning because I was taught the rational planning process. The rational planning process, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is very linear and it's very data driven for what things we decided we wanted to measure. And those were traffic counts were important, number of fatalities in a vehicle were important, number of minutes of delay at an intersection, driver behavior based on demographics, forecasted demand between origin and destination, and the lane miles of interstate, expressway, arterial, and local roads. So there's a lot going on in all of this, is that our performance metrics were too narrow, our problem statements were too narrow, and our rational planning process only measured the data that we wanted to measure, and anything else that was brought up by the community, because the community sees us as needing to advance a lot more performance metrics of what they need, that none of that data would ever be collected because, well, we'll do that someday down the road, but we don't have the data today, so we don't know how to actually give your lived experience any kind of justification. So let's move on to the next slide. So this is a good visual of what happened in Portland to the parallel of Veronica's example. Portland, we built I-5. If you see the bridge going across in the upper left-hand corner, you can see I-5 corridor starting to develop there. We basically took out most of the Albina neighborhood for everything between I-5 and created the lack of access across the community, but then we took out the entire community structure by moving out folks for a convention center, a coliseum, the Blazer Stadium, and a hospital, and all based on urban renewal. And so obviously the impacts and the intergenerational wealth that was taken out of this community were huge, and we're working to repair that damage, but it's going to take decades and decades to repair 40 decades or 60 decades or 6 decades of dismantlement of this neighborhood. However, I just wanted to point out this is what has led us to this point of this rational planning process. So next slide. Everybody on this webinar will recognize this very linear process that we create a problem statement, and you can say it's an EIS process or an EA process or just a regular planning process, but there's a problem statement, there's a scope, there's a purpose and need, there's a plan, there's a design, and then we go into construction. Usually what happens is that at the end of each of those arrows, we will have made a decision internally based on a very narrow scoping, and we will go out to the public and let them know what our decision was made. And that's called community engagement. And maybe we might hear something that, engages us, and we'll make a little tweak, but we don't go back out and talk to anybody. We hear it, we take it in, we move forward, and decisions are made, and we are efficient. That is a rational planning process. There's data to back up that we don't need to worry about anybody else's justifications or worries or the larger community impacts. We are given legislative authority, we are given federal authority, we are moving forward. And that has led us, again, to a lot of what we've seen in many of our cities of not actually looking at community needs, but moving cars as fast as we can, as safely as can at those higher speeds. Next slide. So we delve into what does it mean to do business differently, and we talk about the community-based solutions approach. Over time, there's been tools that have never been required by state DOTs, mostly because those 4 performance metrics for successful project delivery I discussed earlier were never supplemented with other expected performance metrics. We've had a lot of conversations over time about context-sensitive design, practical design, demand management. They're all tools, but they're never required. So in this book, we included a new approach called the community solutions-based approach, which shows how community can and should be involved in providing feedback and helping to test our assumptions throughout the entire project from the problem statement through to construction. Next slide. So here's what it looks like. This is the finale of the entire book, but it's broken down into each one of these loops. I call them learning loops. So our profession can be a force for good if we work to not get consensus, but we get ownership in a process and the outcomes, and we recognize that we're not there to perfect a narrow scope, but to provide 80% of the best that we can for a lot more people and redo some of those prioritizations that Veronica was talking about. Carlos Basaris, who is one of my favorite DOT directors, he's in Utah, he said, "We are incredibly lucky to be in this profession. I can't think of many professions that you can touch every single person in a community. If you care about doing something that makes a difference for people, I can't think of a better profession. As we move forward, it's not going to get easier, it's going to get harder. The more we look to understand people and what's important to people, the more complicated it gets. People are pretty dang complicated. You're still going to need the formulas because the work you do is super important, but you have to think about how to apply your engineering and planning skills to solve people problems. That is what we strive for, you and me, finding ways to support people, all people, so that they are thriving, not surviving. Then and only then will we recognize and fill the gaps and disparity, and only then will everyone feel safe in their communities." So in order to hear from as many perspectives as we possibly can, each one of these learning loops is basically at its core the opportunity to test your assumptions. We do not approach our profession in an outwardly way that says, that opens us up to learning to test our assumptions. So the way we set this up is if you were to start a brand new project, or if things are going sideways, you would have the ability to start learning why things are going sideways, or how to set up the best process you possibly can for the things that are important for the community that these projects are sitting in. So you can see, and we'll go on to the next slide, and be careful because there's going to be a lot of white in your cornea, and lenses may not. Okay, there it is. I zoomed in on this so that you could see, but let's say you're starting a new project, you assemble a project team. The first thing you should do is learn, listen, context, define these things with your project team, figure out what your assumptions are, and then start testing those assumptions in small one-on-one conversations with thought leaders, with elected officials, with community leaders. It all over one-on-one. Are we assuming the right things, or are we not seeing the full vision? And then redraft that problem statement and go through this loop until you feel like you have iterated enough that enough people are like, you see me, you understand my problem, and you're not discluding it at the beginning. You're putting me in the problem statement. You're not discluding me from the problem statement. Once you feel like you've gotten to that point, then you can establish an advisory committee and re-look at that, finalizing the problem statement, again, testing it with community in a larger way, in a more transparent way, and then start thinking about scoping. See how I just did that? We are not going to scope the project until we've got the problem statement right. And then we keep iterating. And then move to the next slide. That is true with planning and testing, planning and designing, testing, right? We are continually looking at how we can do that. And when we plan and test, we're not looking at one project proposal. We are looking at developing scenarios and creating metrics that actually reflect what we've heard in the problem statement. And we're not discluding lived experience. The next slide just goes down to the bottom of all that. We included in our learning loops community benefits agreements. This is a placeholder for how are you going to not only design a project, but bring in everybody to be able to not just get to who's going to work on the project, which is super duper important, but it's also how are you recognizing the specific impacts and what you're going to be doing to mitigate those impacts as part of, not afterwards, as part of the design. So we tried to include that in there to make sure that it's a completely transparent conversation, and you're having the hard conversations and you're iterating to learn and grow, and not just say, oh, a community benefits agreement is just, you know, X, Y, and Z, and we're never going to be able to get that DBE outcome because blah, 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 blah. It's actually saying we are going to do this, right? Moving on to the next slide. So the Oregon Metro Transportation ballot measure is discussed in the book. While we weren't successful at the ballot, the way we went about creating it was universally loved by everybody across the spectrum, from business to community. And we looked at 13 corridors. We recognized that these corridors were the areas that were the most disinvestment over time, with the most low income and high minority communities. This road we're looking at here is 82nd Avenue. It's one of those 13 corridors, but it took us 4 years in preparation to get to the ballot. And we started with the fact that we knew that we wanted more people participating from these communities than we had ever had in the past in order to design the ballot measure itself. So we worked to do capacity building in our CBOs throughout the region, getting them ready to compete for RFPs for community engagement. And they did the majority of the community engagement within these corridors, in community, in the languages that are spoken in those communities, with Metro staff in the background, just there for questions. But all of the conversations were led by the CBOs, who had then been able to take what they have learned in terms of acronyms and engineering and blah, 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 and be able to interpret that and bring the two together of the lived experience. So our project did not start in each of these corridors with traffic engineers laying out what the problem statement was. It was by 100% the lived experience, from small business to medium business to people living, working, and playing in these corridors, defining what the project should be within these corridors. Which then led to us also working on teams from across these corridors on the specific projects. In the end, I'll just give you one example. All 13 corridors, lights, street lights were like one of the number one, besides trees and safe crossings. But the street lights, we had 5,000 street lights called out for in these corridors, but we also learned that we needed to rethink what the light spectrum would be on those street lights so that we could actually illuminate darker skin, so that we could actually increase safety. Just one of the many things we learned as we went through this ballot measure. But how you get people prepared to have a conversation, how you are engaged, and who leads those conversations is probably one of the most important things I could point out. from that ballot measure. Next slide. I just wanted to point out a smaller project. When I was at WashDOT, we had a team that was trying to implement this idea of community engagement in a different way. They had already designed a roundabout for what they had perceived as a problem statement. They went out and they did community engagement. And what they found is that everybody was coming up to them and saying, wow, that's a really beautiful roundabout, but it's at the wrong spot. And so our folks went back and said, we did the analysis. It turns out that the intersection upstream is actually causing a lot of the problems downstream, and they ended up building 2 roundabouts. So if they had not gone out, we would have spent all this money and still have not solved the entirety of the problem, and we would still have safety issues. So it's the importance of testing your assumptions. Never assume that you know everything about how a community functions. There is, the best quote ever was the Secretary of DOT in Hawaii, now Ed Sniffen, who said, the worst thing I did was tell everybody to stop using their Google Maps to design their projects and go out and drive their project. I should have told them to go out and walk their project, bike their project, take transit through their project. Don't just drive through your project. You need to know and understand how community needs this project to work for them. Next slide. And then I would just encourage you to look more into this so I can round this conversation out. Claiborne Avenue in New Orleans was, again, historically, this whole beautiful landscape you see here that was the cultural hub of New Orleans was wiped out by a project. And next slide. Looks like this now. This is Claiborne Avenue now with a very high elevated highway expressway running through it. And what was different is that when the idea, there had been a long talk about removing this highway and this elevated structure. When the conversation started, they decided to do it differently and really let the community lead the process. And there was a short-term ask and a long-term ask. Yes, we want this gone, and we want our community to be knit back together and repaired. But in the meantime, how do we deal with this atrocity? And how do we actually make it less of a barrier going forward until the highway is removed? So they have been working on both, and it is in line for federal money now because of the process and the ownership that was gotten from just doing business differently and letting community lead the conversation. Next slide. And there we go. We have a long way to go, but if we challenge the rational planning process, challenge our assumptions about engineering performance metrics, and really get into a learning culture, I think that we can make a lot more positive changes in people's lives. So with that, I just want to encourage you to go ahead and buy both books because I think they work in tandem. I think that's why Island Press, Veronica and I were talking, really pushed them out at the same time. We have a lot to work on to change these processes, but one step at a time, we can make that difference. So thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Those were really great presentations, and the questions are equally great. So throughout the webinar, we've been assembling the questions from our audience. So let's get to those questions. A couple people have asked about the nature of engineering, and you are both engineering and planners, but not all engineers are also planners. So how do you reconcile the need to consult the community with engineers who may not have public outreach training or may be biased towards their perceived role of moving traffic as quickly as possible? And how do we address that in the future? I think, Veronica, you're still muted.
Okay, there we go. That I think is part of the reason why Lynn and I both wrote our books. I know that for me, in engineering, when I was in hardcore design, my undergrad is civil and in design, transportation design, I never learned how to design a sidewalk. Forget about bike lanes. I never learned how to design a sidewalk. I learned how to design roads. I learned how to do cut and fill and design the road. Even my capstone project to graduate was a group project where we designed a highway near a cemetery. So that is part of the challenge. And that's, I think, part of the reason why I think both of these books are essential. I know that for me, my focus of my book was the next generation for engineers and planners to understand that the technical part of engineering isn't really all that hard. If we're just going to be honest, it's not that hard to design a bike lane, not that hard to design a transit facility, whatever it is. It's relatively easy. It's the people that make it hard. It's the land uses that make it challenging. And so that is why, I focused, the book, thinking about that demographic, because we do need to shift. And it's slowly happening. The fact that you have ITE has not even just written a Vision Zero statement, but they have really tried to advance a conversation amongst the traffic engineers, looking at other metrics, whether it's multimodal level of service and others. And I know we're still waiting on the trickle down, but at least the conversation is happening, which is better than nothing. If you look at the American Society of Civil Engineers, they've adopted Vision Zero policies and all of those things. It takes time to change an industry, particularly when, to be frank, there are people in the industry who don't want it to change. They are perfectly fine the way it is, so that we can do our bridge, calendars every year, or infrastructure calendars every year. I've never seen a bike lane in them. And so I think that we will get there over time. I also think it is important, and I know for me, I've been pushing this for the 2 universities that I went to really expand the curriculum of civil engineers to include public speaking. I know that for me, I got, my English 101 class, and I had a technical writing class, but I never learned how to publicly speak. I never learned how to present. And I think that is absolutely critical skill for engineers to have, so that they can just communicate the technical engineering side of things.
Right. Great.
Yeah, all of that. All of that. I think, I think the number one thing to positively think about is that you go into engineering because you want to solve problems. And if you are given a problem statement, and this, my husband is also an engineer, but he's advanced research and design. I will give him a problem statement at home, and because he's advanced research and design, he will spend a good solid several years designing tables for our dining room table, and then build several different types of prototypes to see how they work. And I still don't have a solid dining room table. But it's an iterative process for him in the private sector of trying to figure out what is the problem statement in totality? What am I trying to do? It's a testing, it's a continual learning. In engineering, we were never taught that there was an iterative process to any part of this. It was literally, this intersection doesn't meet level of service standards, boom, here's the standard, we got to put 2 left turn lanes in, we got to, right? Because we assume that the problem statement never includes demand management. We assume that the problem statement never includes health outcomes, right? So we as society have been giving a very narrow problem statement and expecting a very narrow outcome, and we need to start demanding more, but we also need to give them the tools and the space and the time, because I don't know how many of you read the Transcontinental Railroad book by Stephen Ambrose, but I'm going to paraphrase, but he basically said compared to Europe, when they were building their transportation systems from the canals to the railroads, they thought about how all these pieces would work together. They put some time and energy into it, just like my husband with the dining room table. And in America, we just got the goddamn road in, and then we said, we'll fix it later. We'll just fix it later. Well, we're still fixing it later, and it's not, we got to get out of that mode. We have to actually put the time up front because it reduces the risk at the back end. And we are not in that mind frame. We need to shift that.
So a couple of people have asked about transparency. First, through the hospitalization prioritization, how do we make prioritization decisions more transparent? But also, how do we build trust in the community so that when we go out to do a process like the learning loop, how do we build and maintain the trust of the community as planners and transportation professionals? What's your recommendation for that?
Well, I think for transparency, it's going to come down to having something that at least outlines a vision. And I know most cities at this point, a lot still don't have at least a vision zero policy plan or something. And with that, it spells out different action steps, different priorities, the data and things like that. Or, some cities may have a master transportation plan and how they built it. And so I think that is a way to communicate some of the priorities of a city. I will say one of the challenges right now is there's just a lot of distrust, and it's beyond, it's not even a city government thing. I think it's just a lot of distrust. I know that it feels like every other day there's a TPI, a quest for information under the Freedom of Information Act. Like everything, it's like there is a distrust, and I don't know if it's something. It's probably an outgrowth of COVID and whether people feel like the elections were accurate or not. And so I think that kind of distrust is permeating in a way that in some cases that there's not really much you can do. There's just going to be people, it doesn't really matter what decision you make, what you do, what data you show, they're not going to trust anything, trust what you say. And so I think that's where the balance comes in, is how much, and it's going to depend on the project, but it comes down to how much time, effort, and energy are you going to put in to try to convince someone that that is unconvincible. They have a narrative in their mind, and it really doesn't matter. Even after something is installed, if you're talking about a bike lane or something, they still don't trust it, even though they can see it with their own eyes. So I think that's kind of the balance and the kind of wisdom and discernment that is going to be needed moving forward.
I think the only thing I would add to that is the only way to get through this moment of time is that the number one thing that I hear from communities, don't talk to me when you need something from me, talk to me on a continual basis, right? And that is where we struggle in my day job, is community engagement writ large has only been to a narrow set of folks who could get the access. And when you increase your prioritization of what communities in terms of low income and minority communities, trying to bring that level of access up, we have overcompensated and left a lot of folks out of our conversations. So we have gone to, we're trying to figure out how to balance it, because you do have limited resources. So how do you let everybody at a base level in your community know what's about to happen or what conversation you're starting, but with an emphasis on a racial equity lens? How do you do that and not tip it to the point where you're only talking to? And it is a continual learning process for us, but because we're losing transparency with a whole nother part of our community. So we're having to reestablish what does it mean to be transparent and accountable, with an emphasis on it's it's a daily struggle. And the thing I appreciate the most is that we're having the conversation and we're saying out loud, how do we do this? Because before in the past, in at least in the Portland metro region, we weren't even having the conversation. So I appreciate that we are having hard discussions out loud.
Agreed. There's a question here about does supporting walkable communities and transit necessarily have to mean that we are at odds with Americans' desires to keep their own personal vehicles? And I've heard this question asked around the discussion of electrification. When we're talking about electrification for transportation in the United States, we mostly mean personally owned vehicles. So we're not necessarily talking about giving up our vehicles. How do we reconcile that as people who may or may not like our cars, but also want to live and be in walkable, safe environments for human beings outside of the car?
So I think part of the challenge, though, is we have done such a disservice to people who are just trying to walk or use transit, that any attempt to make a walkable or transit-friendly neighborhood feels like it's at odds with cars. And the reality is, it's about giving people a choice. So right now, if you have a street, there is no choice. My only choice is to drive. So even if something is a quarter of a mile away that I may want to walk or bike to, I am unable to make that choice. So right now it's, you have freedom, but we don't. You can choose to drive your car every day, but the problem is no one has the freedom to make any other choice. And I think that's what gets missed in this conversation. If you want to drive until your last breath, that is perfectly okay. But there are people who want to walk, who want to bike, who want to use transit. And so it's about giving that person a choice. And it doesn't mean they're going to do it every day. I think that's the other kind of piece. It's that someone may drive today or take the bus tomorrow. And I think that when you look at the younger generation, they are not getting driver's license at the rate that we were in the future. And that is, I'm not making that data up. I know that Federal Highway has been tracking it, but the younger generation, they're not getting driver's license. So then you're forcing them to drive if you don't provide any alternatives. And I think that's the perspective to try to make sure people understand as we are trying to introduce more options for the people who want to use another option.
I think that's a great answer.
Okay. A couple of people have asked about providing transit, and I'm going to combine two questions. One asks, how can we improve transportation for rural communities and connecting them to shoppers and to shopping and workers to their jobs? And someone from the DC area asks about how do we improve transit so that it takes less, it's faster and sort of more of the European model to get places. And they give the example of Silver Spring to Dulles Airport is a 2-hour transit ride, which is longer than actually sitting in traffic in your car. How do we work on those issues as well in a country where our infrastructure is largely built and it exists? How do we do that wisely and economically?
There's a good example case study in our book on a rural transit district that was out of Vail, and how the transit system wasn't actually working for those who needed it the most. And how just sitting down and talking with community through the healthcare system, they figured out what were the barriers, and then they changed it up, and how people accessed information, even in order to be able to get the information when next bus would come, the folks didn't have internet. Well, they didn't have internet service, and sometimes they shut off their cell. So could you have a downloadable information on your cell phone? Because they did have the cell phone, but they just didn't have access to the internet all the time. So I think it does come down to the same process where we have to test our assumptions and really be more open. I know my entire time in transit, we have struggled against the fixed route being the only way to deliver transit. And demand responsive fixed route, the combination, like finding ways to be more innovative about how we provide that transit, especially out in the rural areas. And the number of rural districts that are not connected, we've had that problem here, and just getting them connected so that people can transfer easily up and down the coast, and getting back into the valley, up and over the mountains, just being able to coordinate that had huge impacts on access. So.
Yeah, I agree on the rural side. I know that there are different communities that are, looking at demand management, on-demand transit rather, in order to help people move around. I do know that, in Cornell, great example of, a really great park and ride system for the rural areas into the work centers. And it's going to be different for every community, depending on where people need to get to. But even for people who weren't trying to get to one of the universities for work, the park and ride still afforded them the ability to get into town, to do whatever shopping or errands that they needed to do. So I think there's some models out there. There was another part of the question. Oh, transit in general. So there was a question specific to the DC region. If you look at the European models, and I know when I was in Paris, I was moved by transit almost. It was easier to do transit than anything else. That include biking and walking. It was really easy to use transit, but it was because of the density of transit. I think that even when you look at the DC region, the challenge of that system is we designed it to get from the suburbs to downtown. The connectivity between the outside of the spokes has always been missing, and that's why there's the investment in the Purple Line, at least to connect on the Maryland side, the outer edges. So if you're looking at how do we have a better connectivity between communities in Maryland and Dulles, I know there's a lot of debate, and I'm not going to wade into it about having another bridge crossing for cars, but there could be, with a bolder vision, additional bridge crossings that you could introduce transit to be able to make that connection versus having to come into DC and then going back out to Dulles. And so some of that is the models exist. I think the challenge, there has been more investment under the bipartisan infrastructure law, but the challenge is the expectations of transit. It is when we do a highway project, you just really have to, say what you're going to do, say the purpose and need for the project, and you design it and build it. On the transit side, they have to get into the financial feasibility, and we hold transit to a different standard than we do highways. And I think until we really tackle that, until we really tackle how we determine how we are going to fund projects, we're always going to struggle with introducing transit into the network.
100%. To combine the last question with this question, I think we need to put into perspective and let folks tell their lived experience of those who don't live in transit-rich areas, which is the majority of our major metropolitan regions outside of maybe a mile out of a core, maybe 2 miles out of the core. I don't think that we should be punitive, because I think what we need to hear is the stories I can't afford to live anywhere close to transit, right? So in the Portland metro region right now, you need to make, and this may seem to West Coast or East Coast, we're still less than in cost of living, but it's really high, $26 an hour to be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment anywhere in the entirety of the region. So people are being pushed out even though our minimum wage in the state is now, just under 15. That is still a long ways away from $26 an hour. And so if we are forcing people to live further and further and further out to just to have a home, just to have anything over their head, we need to understand that we have now created a situation nationwide with the lack of affordable housing that are now making people very dependent on being able to have a car because there is no transit, none. And so when people don't wage a war on cars, figure out what it is that people need. And if it means that it's affordable housing and more affordable housing closer to transit, focus on that rather than waging a war against the very people who we want to help.
Right. That kind of leads into the next question, which is about inclusive transportation and walkability. And I'm going to read it. Their concern is that inclusive transportation that is walkable is often leads to unaffordable development that leads to gentrification. How do we improve that or prevent gentrification from the types of investments that make communities more attractive places to live?
So I struggle with gentrification because I feel like it is too general of a term sometimes of how it happens and why it happens. There's absolutely systematic of purchasing properties and systematically moving poor people out. I'm not gonna say that doesn't. It absolutely does exist. But I've also seen where grandma, lived in the community and grandma passes away and the kids have moved on to have a different life somewhere else and the family chooses to sell the home. And this is where market forces come in of everybody wants to sell their home for the most amount of money. And so it becomes complicated because the neighborhood is changing because someone may have purchased a house at a higher rate than someone that sold it, but that family that sold it should have made some amount of money off of the sell. So it's complicated. I say that, but I also don't. I think that the bike lanes and sidewalks always get blamed for gentrification. I think the market forces are always there. Usually what really happens is you have a community that's just gotten used to disinvestment that they stop complaining. They've complained to their council member and they elect new council members, they still don't get anything. They've complained to their mayor, they've complained to their county commissioner, they've complained. And so now it's 40 years later and they're like, you know what, no one's coming. And so they've moved on. And then you have new people moved in that may have a different level of political savviness or have a different level of access. And now you see that the sidewalk is getting fixed that hasn't been fixed for the last 40 years, or you see the investment in the neighborhood that you didn't see before. So I think that tends to happen more, and it just becomes a symbol of gentrification versus the cause of gentrification.
Right.
Let me just bring light rail. Portland has, for the last 4 decades been very much in building out a light rail system. And through that light rail system, it's no different than putting a highway through a community, and you increase land values. And urban renewal was used for most of those projects. And so we have come to be very upfront with the fact that we have caused gentrification through light rail projects and transit-oriented development in basically undervaluing at the time when people are looking to buy property around where the new transit-oriented development zoning has gone in and the station is being built, and that land changes hand and the intergenerational wealth stops at that sale. Because now where do they go in order to be able to afford the community? So the number one thing that we have been moving towards is listening again to the community and their needs holistically as we move forward with either bus rapid transit or with light rail, and marrying a pot of money wherever we can get it to be able to secure existing affordable housing and keeping it. I wouldn't say that we are all the way there and have all the tools that we need, but we at least, again, are out loud and talking about how do we not lose the affordable housing in that area where that improvement is going to go? What are the tools that we have? What more do we have to do to make sure that folks can remain there and not feel like they're being pushed out? It's totally complicated and it's hard, but it's slowly happening here, and hopefully we have more examples as we move forward. But it's just, it's super hard to get people to marry housing and transportation, even in this region that thinks that they are totally integrated and totally understand it and totally on board. You still have barriers in order to get it done.
And adding to that, I think it also becomes a challenging on the funding side, because there are times when USDOT and HUD are not moving in necessarily the same direction in order to achieve truly that kind of housing transit investment as you move forward. And so then that complicates things. And then zoning, frankly, complicates a lot of things, because while for many of us it has been a tool to get mixed use communities, mixed income communities, and all of that, it's also been a tool to keep people out of communities. It's the legalized redlining, if you will. And so that's the other kind of challenge, particularly when you say, nope, this is only going to be a single family home neighborhood, and whoever's here is here, and new people, you got to be able to afford to come in. I think that's also kind of a part of it, where you can get an increase of housing, and it's just you have a demand to be in a certain neighborhood.
Right.
Let me just add a plug for a positive movement that's happening in Portland that was the brainchild of Rakaya Adams. It's called the Albina Vision Trust, if you want to Google it. It is an initiative to work the I-5 collage of pictures that I showed from the 60s. It's a very, very highly focused initiative to be able to repair and rebuild a diverse community back into that space by not relying on government to do it, by actually creating the opportunity for it to be community led and community controlled through private investment. And Rakaya's former Wall Street, third generation or fourth generation in Albina community wanted to come back and figure out how to do that. They've gotten to the point where they now own several buildings and parcels of property. But on top of that, Phil Knight, who was actually part of the gentrification in the early days, his family, founder of Nike, lived in Albina. He has now provided $400 million to a fund to be able to raise another $600 million, so that the Albina Vision Trust and its foundation will have up to $1 billion to be able to purchase, build, and structure intergenerational wealth creation in this community. So it's a completely different way to think about how to work on repair, but Metro has been helping them get to the place where that they are today with planning money and actual land purchase money.
Great, thank you. I think you've demonstrated the complexities and the interconnectedness of all of these issues. And we have so many more questions that we don't have time to get to. But the last question that I saved is from a colleague, and he asks, how do you retain your optimism to accomplish worthy goals in the face of so many social, economic, environmental, and other issues that at times feel overwhelming?
I'll say this, I think that you have to remember, it's, I think they say life is like a marathon. It's not, it's more like a HIIT workout. There's going to be periods where you can, boom ahead. There's periods of rest and recovery. And I say that because I think that sometimes there can be an impatience around change. But when you look at the civil rights movement, it wasn't like, MLK gave a "I Have a Dream" speech, and then all of a sudden, hey, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Like that's not how it happened. You're talking about things that were decades in the making, to get to where we needed to be. And so I think that that's a reminder and keeping the optimism that there may be, little disappointments, along the way, but you have to keep chipping and chipping and chipping. And eventually you get the change that you need. And as I stated, as the fact that even the engineering community is not just talking about Vision Zero, but the fact that there are detailed, conversations, discussions, and work groups, and it can feel like nothing, but it is something that is a big deal for the industry to even embrace these conversations. And so to me, that's optimism. It's every little thing gets you to where you are. It's eating an elephant. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so just remembering it's a long game. And you got to stay in it and take rest when needed, because there's going to be days where you're frustrated, so you take the rest, you rejuvenate, and then you get back in it and live another day. So got to keep the optimism.
This is going to be a total political answer, not the engineer. The only way I have found to move forward is to embrace that perfection is the enemy of the good. And if you truly want to invite a larger conversation and bring different perspectives to the table, even if they're on the other side of the political aisle from me, I believe that there is a kernel of a reason of why they are mad or upset, and that it is a true experience that they've had, and you need to recognize that. And so 80% of good or perfect is great. It's moving forward. And where we have built up the distrust is that we are literally spinning the drain on everybody's issues, because we cannot land the plane because we're looking for perfection on somebody's single perspective. And so I would just encourage you to think about what's 80% of perfect and be okay with that, because you literally, we cannot get ourselves into the all or nothing, because all or nothing means that we have left people crossing the streets to be hit right on the way to a bus. That's what we've done. Getting 20% of the safe crossings out on a road is better than not having any. And so I think we all have to take that perspective when we're advocating. You strive for the perfection, but you come back down. It's part of negotiation. It's part about it being a society, and we've lost the ability to respect each other's positions and then come to the best solution we can in that moment. But we've also lost the ability to spend the time doing that because of what I just talked about with like Stephan Ambrose's perspective. We are about getting a project done and wanting it done immediately and not willing to spend the time up front to get it right. And so I would just encourage you all to like slow-mo through the beginnings of your projects, and then start to see the results on the back end, and teach people how to do that, and ask for help. If you're the engineer, don't be the upfront person negotiating. Find a way to find others who have those skills. If you're the planner and you don't understand the engineer, find an engineer that's going to help you, do that. Don't assume that you know everything. Test every assumption and create ownership.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful discussion. Before we wrap, can you just give the discount code again for the Island Press site so that people can purchase your books? I believe
it is SMART Capital, capital, SMART, all caps.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to offer my deepest gratitude to Veronica and Lynn for their presentations and this engaging discussion. Thank you to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications guru, who helped this run fairly smoothly today. This is our first one in a while, so please bear with us. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted online. When you exit today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so we can continue to improve the webinar experience. All attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email box for details on future webinars, including our upcoming Walktober Walk-in-Our programs sponsored by the Maryland Department of Transportation, which take place every Thursday in October. The first Walk-in-Our will feature Mike McGinn of America Walks and Mike Watson of Director of Livable Communities at AARP. It will take place on October 5th, beginning at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. We hope you can join us and have a great day. Thank you.